Innovation is a buzzword. It is used way too often in boardrooms. Innovation is used by the government. We need to foster innovation. We need to invest in innovation to drive growth of our economy. You can actually take a class in innovation nowadays because it is offered at universities. So innovation seems to be everything. But it's not everything, it's the only thing. And I'm going to claim that's nowadays an open and digital thing. I'll give you 3 seconds to think of an innovation. 1, 2, 3. I guess you have different ideas what an innovation is about. A new product, a new service, a new business model, or a new process. So it means any novel idea to change to a system. But what's the difference between an innovation and an invention? And it creates value. It creates financial value. And that's why firms innovate. That's why they do that. That's why they need to do it. That's why it's the only thing. But this requires us to create value first for the user. What do you want as a user? You want more time? You want more experience? Any additional service value, social value? We learned about that in the keynote speak this morning. You need to think of that first, creating value. Then you can think about capturing value. Because innovation is so important, because there are studies in my field among other researchers that those that innovate, that basically release innovative products also have a higher growth rate. Firms thought of they have to foster innovation differently. And I think that innovation about special people, scientists, developers, that you close or wall off from others, try to control, try to get patents, etc. That's what the traditional industrial model of innovation was about. And I also thought of time. It takes time to innovate. But since 2003, there's the emerging phenomenon of so-called open innovation. And a professor of UC Berkeley wrote that book saying innovation game has changed. We live in a global economy where there's IT, where innovation is not closed anymore. It's open. Nowadays, it's become a buzzword. Who has not heard of open innovation so far? Who has heard of open innovation? Oh. So there are firms like Procter & Gamble that claim that they're the open innovation pioneers. So you might have heard of Pringle prints, the printed chips. They're printed with ink technology. This idea was not coming out of Procter & Gamble. What they did is they kind of circulated a call for ideas in their community. And at the end of the day, it was a small baker in Italy that had that ink technology already in place. So Pringle Prints, it was very famous in America, it's not so famous in Europe, is actually an innovation that is coming outside of Procter & Gamble. And it's a hype term. If you now do a search, I guess you get a higher hit rate than I got a few months ago. So what does that actually mean? This is a very simplistic model of open innovation. The easiest way to describe is to contrast the open model with the closed model. In the closed model, you have that funnel. You first need a lot of ideas because at the end, you maybe have only 5% of those that you take further. And you try to control that, and those that are not relevant for your business, that don't fit in your pipeline, you stop them. You don't take them further. In the open innovation model, you purposefully engage with others, with startups, with customers, with suppliers, to take their ideas, their knowledge, to accelerate your own innovation activities, just as Procter & Gamble has done it. Or the other way around. You see that a lot of your ideas, your technologies are not used. Actually, I think 5 to 10% of the patents that are actually held by firms are used. So that's why, for example, IBM in 2006 identified that it created a new income flow through selling patents, getting licensing. So also taking ideas from inside out, giving it to others. That's a theme that's widely known in the open source community. But open innovation doesn't mean that you give everything away for free, but that you're aware of what you should basically own You're aware where you should open up. And firms like GE also use that model. And one of these open innovation practices is, for example, startup competitions to address key social challenges, big challenges, so like the energy of our future. So they put up this competition, this contest about powering your home, powering your grid, and they invited inventors, technologists, and other firms to submit ideas. And they had a board of experts. They evaluated those. And at the end, they had a lot of submissions. More than 75 entrepreneurs submitted. And they formed 23 partnerships. And then, in the end, invested $200 million, jointly with other venture capitalists. It was also an experiment for GE, for them internally, because they couldn't basically use the IP rules they were thinking of before. But when I spoke to them, they said, now, after this experiment, now the work begins, because we have to change ourselves internally, engage in new processes, new leadership capabilities. A colleague of mine, we actually performed a study on the adoption of open innovation in large firms just this year, because it's now 10 years that we talk about that. And some actually say it's a fad, it's disappearing, you have to, close it again. What we learned is that a lot of these big firms, we only looked into big firms, are actually practicing open innovation. They have started about 5 years ago, and they haven't abandoned it. They increased their management support for it, and they also increased their activity. But what's important is, the most difficult thing actually is to make that change happen. It's not about, getting rid of not invented here because you don't want to share. It's about making that change happen, and it relates to different practices, areas. And what we're learning now as well is that the gravity is shifting, and what we learned in the keynote speak this morning, it's not just about opening up one organization, it's about involving individuals, social networks in this discussion. We're now moving to a next stage of open innovation, not just opening one firm and having a central hub, but actually having decentralized, personalized networks, which requires new infrastructures, new management skills, new leaders that know that it's not about controlling, it's about facilitation. It requires experimentation, and it requires thinking of an ecosystem that you create over a life cycle. And not just the developers, where you also think of the service providers that you need later on. If you're not failing every now and again, it's a sign you're not doing something new, not very innovative. Thank you.
Thank you, Sabine.